Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to the HPHR Journal Insights podcast. HPHR Journal is an independent academic referred journal that seeks to improve health equity and social justice through the publication of content grounded in the thoughtful evaluation of evidence. It is published by the Boston Congress of Public Health, a nonprofit organization that addresses social change at the nexus of public health, health equity, and social justice. This podcast delves into articles published in HPHR Journal that address complex public health issues in an effort to affect social change. My name is Riva Bajuri, and I will be your host today. Today, I'm joined by Louis Lynn, co-author of A Framework for Public Health Crises, How America Has Used Public Health to Justify Exclusionary Immigration Laws, and Where We Go From Here. His article can be found in HPHR Journal edition 37, available on hphr.org. To start off, please introduce yourself, your professional background, and the content of your research.
Hi, it's great to be here. My name is Louis Lynn. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm currently a first year student at Harvard Law School, and my interests are in this intersection of immigration law and public health. Before coming to Harvard, and where this research came out of was through my master's in public health that I did at the University of Pennsylvania. And that centered around a lot of the intersections of health and immigration and looking at how public health has been a means of justifying these exclusionary immigration laws throughout not just COVID-19, but throughout American history. And I wanted to probe that a little bit more through the capstone, stuck with it with my professor, and ultimately was able to publish it here.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for being here. We're very excited to have you. I was wondering why you chose this research topic to begin with.
Yeah. I came into my public health degree knowing that I wanted to focus on looking at immigrant populations. And ultimately, I wanted to go to law school. So I was trying to find this way that I could inject some of that law side and policy side of work into the public health realms of research that we were doing. So working with my professor and capstone research director, we were able to look at a way that I was able to actually combine all of my interests in immigration law and looking at how not just looking at public health law, but looking at how immigration law actually has been a driving force in terms of how public health has actually been adjudicated and looked at through different policies amongst time. I come from an immigrant family, so being the son of immigrants, I wanted to look at this intersection and helped me a lot in terms of both policy, data, research, but also cementing some of the interests that I had in my post law school career.
Very interesting and very cool to see how your background kind of informed your research interests. As someone who comes from a similar background, it's very cool to see that in other people as well. I was hoping you could discuss some of the literature that inspired your research.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really inspired it was I was an Asian American Studies minor in undergrad, and one of the things that we looked at, or at least that I looked at because of my interest in public health, was how immigrants were treated at places like Ellis Island and Angel Island, and then looking at the ways that immigrants in the US, once they got here, were then treated through various ordinances and laws that states and local localities were doing. And part of that literature that comes from it is this idea or this conception of the way that policymakers have looked at immigrants, or even just not policymakers, but general American society looked at immigrants as a means of germ carriers or foreigners, and looking at how when they are coming in, people are bringing in germs and bringing in something that could be spread in the country. And I think that lens of looking at immigration has been troubling, especially as somebody who wants to have more grounded public health evidence as the means of why we do immigration laws, as opposed to this fear that ends up driving a lot of immigration law. So I looked at things like I said, the treatment of the hospitals at Ellis Island, but then also looking at policies like San Francisco and how Chinatowns were then segregated, and looking at how germs were one of the reasons that when there was a plague spreading, that there were isolation of people, and how we have looked specifically at immigrants as a means of public health control, and looking at that power dynamic was really interesting, and that then drew to today when I was starting this research, looking at Title 42, which was happening during COVID, and I wanted to see, okay, so if Title 42 is something that's happening now, this probably isn't the only time that it's happened. Let's look into the past and see how there has been a thread of when this might have happened in the past.
Great. Now, you mentioned Title 42. Could you go into further detail about what Title 42 is and what kinds of similar slash, yeah, I guess similar policies in the past were that kind of informed Title 42?
Yeah, so Title 42 specifically was something that it broadly it holds a lot of the ordinance or laws and statutes of the country that relate to public health. So the Public Health Act is housed under, or is part of Title 42. And the specific section that my research was looking at was Title 42, Section 265. This is what was used as a means of justifying what Title 42 expulsions are. So that Title 42 expulsions will be what, when I refer to Title 42 moving forward, is what I'll be focusing on. So essentially, once COVID was starting to spread, there was a Title 42 was used as a means of justifying the controlling and limitation of immigrants coming into the country or migrants coming into the country. And the reason that being that was there was because we were trying to in the justification of it, at least, was to stop the spread of COVID entering the country. And by doing that, we basically cut off immigration or asylum processes at the southern border, northern border, but mostly was at the southern border. So anybody coming into the country, instead of being processed for asylum, basically was told, no, you can't come into the country, and then turned away, violating various different norms and also like human rights conventions of asylum that should have been granted to people coming to the border. And Title 42 essentially was something that has happened for the last 3 years now, saying that anybody coming would not be allowed into the country.
What kinds of effects do you think Title 42 may have had on the social dynamics of the country at the time in terms of race and increased hate crimes against Asian Americans at the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, I think that it's all this a mess of interrelated things, and you can't look at it in isolation. One of the things, like as you mentioned, like increasing Asian hate crimes. One of the things that is a little different with Title 42 is that it's mostly in-person border crossings that were being stopped. So it was a lot of the countries who were being impacted by these were people coming from Southern American or Latin American, Central American countries. So that is one caveat of it. But I do think that this tying of intersectionality is very important and looking at how we were saying that, oh, this is something that, or we have people saying like Wuhan virus or the China virus and people coming into the country and looking at how that narrative further fed into the justification of Title 42 expulsions and almost gave a lot of legitimacy, I guess is the best word for it, of how we were looking at Title 42. There were surveys done even 2 years into COVID-19 and looking at how people saw COVID spread, and you would see that a large portion, granted a chunk of this was majority were in the Republican Party, we're looking at how, or there's a question about what do you think is like the spread or the reason that COVID-19 is still around. And part of that was saying that immigrants were the reason that COVID-19 was such an issue. Um, so I think that the narrative and the interplaying of how we looked at immigration and how we looked at public health aren't necessarily two different prongs or two different arms, but they actually converge at this intersection.
I see. Thank you very much for that clarification. Certainly very interesting to see how the narrative kind of shapes all these things at once. And like you mentioned, the convergence point, very interesting. Now, Back to kind of the specifics of Title 42, could you expand upon what health-related grounds of ineligibility are and how they are related to Title 42?
Yeah. So the health-related grounds of ineligibility was something that started in the 1800s. There was a One of the immigration acts was passed, and essentially it created these different grounds where health could be the reason that when you were applying for your visa or you were applying for a status adjustment of your application once you were in the country, that they would be able to deny your application based off of one of these health reasons. So those included having a communicable disease, having a mental or physical disability, being or once the 2000s came, there was a law that passed that added vaccination requirements to these four grounds, and the fourth one was also having a substance use disorder. Um, so all of these different reasons were ways that if you ended up not meeting the criteria, then feeds into your application getting rejected. And I think this also further goes down into something that interests me was how when we look at this, some people may have looked at or heard about the immigrant health effect, and how sometimes they're actually the first generation of immigrants have higher health outcomes than Americans born citizens. And over time, that they kind of lose that health benefit or effect. And part of that reason is because of these health related grounds of ineligibility. One is because people who have the means of immigrating to the country may have more access to resources. But secondly, is because we are also filtering out and saying, no, if you have a communicable disease, you're not allowed into the country. If you have a physical or mental disability, you're not allowed into the country. So that's one category. And they're housed also under Title 42. They're in a separate section called Section 32, 34. Um, so they're not the same. Title 42 expulsions under COVID was a different section, but under the same, I get title or a bundle of statutes. So the justification for excluding people were different, but I think what pins them together and why I was interested in it is that public health was the reasoning that we justified having both of these things exist.
Very interesting. Thank you. So just to clarify, just to clarify the use of public health, kind of antagonizing that as almost like a weapon
Yeah,
um, against immigrant communities were was kind of what ties these two things together.
yeah, and how if we want to have this a country of high health and looking at the quality of what is a good immigrant versus a bad immigrant, part of that is looking at what health impacts there are. And I say those like good and bad in quotes because I think when we look at power in these dynamics, it's usually governmental power against immigrant applicants, and looking at how good and bad as defined by the American government don't necessarily track into, hey, public health is a reason that we should be denying somebody's application, but that is how we are weaponizing it. Because I think oftentimes it is easier to understand, oh, yeah, sure, we are going to say that public health is the reason that, that makes sense. Public health is the reason why we want to have these policies instead of going to the root of what racism or nativism or I was talking about things like disability and ableism actually are the root causes, and we're using public health as a weaponizing it as a mask of the real reason that is underlying some of the reasons that we push forth these policies as a country.
Very interesting. I That's a lot to take in because on the surface it almost seems that a lot of things done in the name of public health would be for, the health of the public. It would be a good thing. And so to really investigate those policies and see that they are rooted in nativism and racism is very important and also something that I feel like you need to take the extra step to do. It's almost not as intuitive because things are masked
Exactly.
as like for public health.
Exactly. And some of this goes into like the results and policy recommendations that we had. But what we saw in my research was that at the end of the day, like it might make sense at the start of a public health crisis to put forth some of these policies when you don't know a lot about the disease that's spreading, or you this is a new thing that hasn't had a lot of research. But what you see or through the research is that for an example that we compared Title 42 to was HIV. For 22 years, people who tested positive for HIV were denied their immigration statuses or applications, and they had to then go through this whole appeal process and things like that. That was for 22 years after antiviral therapies were created, after we understood how HIV spread, and we let that last. And that same thing is happening now, where a policy that was put in place in March of 2020 still exists today in almost the same form. And when we justify something with public health, then we also have to back it up with once we understand more about the public health crisis, once we have things like vaccinations, once we know more medical research about Title 42's justification for COVID, then things should change. It should not remain stagnant because that's when you further see and expose some of the root causes of why we even implemented these policies in the first place beyond public health.
That's very shocking to hear. But just to reiterate what you said, you would more so support policies that are not so permanent and like a more dynamic viewpoint based on like new information, scientific research, therapies, so that we aren't just kind of implanting a stigma and codifying it into law and then just moving on and disregarding the upstream effects of it. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think one of the exceptions that I made or the caveats that I give is that my stance initial, like where I begin, is looking at this as a human rights violation and that we shouldn't even do this in the first place. And the reason that I give the caveat is because I understand how politics works, and that's likely not going to happen. So my choice one would be we don't even implement these policies in the first place as a because of the root causes that lead to them. But understanding how politicians and governments work is that this likely will happen. If we are going to have to do this, then policymakers need to be more dynamic with it. So I guess that's not like my first choice endorsement. That is my okay, understanding the reality of the situation. If we can't just have these policies not exist, how do we make them so that they are more dynamic, if that makes sense?
Yes, it makes a lot of sense. I totally agree with that. And ideally, these policies would not exist, but in terms of working with what we have, that would be a great improvement from what it seems like we are doing right now.
Sure. Exactly.
All right. My next question is going to be a little bit more geared towards the process of your research study.
Sure.
Um, what were some surprising results of your research and literature review, and did you find any gaps in the available literature?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest gaps that we found was that so I got all of this data, it's ref- just less than 50 years worth of data from the State Department. And some of this data was not something that was accessible through online channels or looking at what is reported and what's being followed. Um, and I think that that just looks or lends itself to understanding what we are and aren't focusing on and how we divert priorities to. So, for example, I was looking at the number of denials for each of the different health related grounds of ineligibility, and then also other related grounds that weren't health related. Um, and that data we have been tracking more of in the more recent years, but that wasn't even something that it existed in large scale. I had to get like PDF scanned for me to see how the numbers of people denied for a communicable disease back in 1980 something, right? And looking at how we need to, if we are putting an emphasis and looking at how immigration is important and public health is important, why are we not necessarily putting all our resources into studying this more? So we didn't really see as much research, and at least in our literature review, that was focused on this quantitative level of it. So I think this was able to or our research is able to add to that field. And then the second part would be looking at when I started this research, it was at the start of COVID. I'm sure there is way more research done now about it, or hopefully there is, but there was just um, far less work done in this field of looking at immigration and COVID-19, and especially at how Title 42 was being addressed. We saw a lot of this done in not necessarily public health research, but a lot of policy and legal advocacy against it. And then we also saw some public health practitioners writing letters and saying like how there is no public health justification for this. What we didn't see was this intersection, and I think that what we were able to do was combine this public health and legal field into one research project.
I just wanted to follow up with a little bit of what you said, especially in regards to the research gap for denials for health ineligibility versus for other reasons. Do you have any idea why there may have been this research gap?
Yeah, this is my thinking is that at the end of the day, health-related grounds of ineligibility have not gotten like broadly too much focus. And I think that also leads to not necessarily having as many people looking at research data that then draws to more research produced and for future directions. Um, so that is my one initial thinking, that I don't think that this is actually a field that has been studied as much, as pretty niche of an area of interest. So I think that is one of the main drivers, and hopefully there are more people who are interested in the field, and hopefully we'll be able to study it. And I think in our research, I created some like future directions of other areas now that this research has been done that could be pursued.
With these research gaps in mind and the limited data you had to work with, how did you shape and design your study to accommodate for some of these gaps?
Yeah. So initially I was looking at this, okay, we're gonna looking at it mostly from a literature review perspective. And once I saw that literature was not necessarily substantive enough to do the review, that's when I pivoted a little bit more to getting way more and like reaching out to do more data collection from a quantitative perspective. And once that happened, I then paired it up with more of a historical analysis as opposed to just looking at what literature there was. So this initially started off as what would have been just a literature review process, and evolved into what became a little bit more quantitative and then more of this historical storytelling uh, of American public health and immigration history. So I think there was that pivot because the literature wasn't as substantive as I would have hoped. Um, and I think for better or for worse, that led to various other things and aspects of Title 42 expulsions that we were able to explore.
With these similar considerations in mind, how did you choose the metrics for your study, specifically the use of the Republican versus Democratic presidential party?
Yeah, that was something that was just mostly out of curiosity of seeing how different administrations approached immigration and approached public health. I think part of that was because of the politicization that happened during COVID-19, and looking at how there was Trump in office and how that led that was begetted by political politicization of public health. So I wanted to see if this was like a trend that happened amongst past administrations and just not knowing what it was. And the second part of that is because immigration policies, unfortunately, for better or for not even for better, for worse, is that there are there's almost a bipartisanship of looking at how immigration policies are created, where oftentimes we talked about stagnation of like there are people who want to push for more progressive policies in immigration. Unfortunately, those policies end up ultimately not always passing. So I was looking at, okay, so if there was more of a conservative lens of looking at how immigration policies are pushed forth, um, is that something that is true? And is there a difference between a Republican and Democratic administrations? If I had more time to do the research, I would have also looked at control of congressional houses and how that also overlaid with immigration policies that were promoted by different presidential administrations.
Very interesting. Um, would you mind expanding upon the other metrics as well?
Yeah. So the other metrics that I looked at were not necessarily were looking at what I guess what I talked a little bit about with HIV, but it wasn't necessarily just looking at presidential administrations, but then looking at how immigration or public health justified immigration policies were approached in the past. So one of the things that we did was looking at this historical analysis, I guess, of looking at Ellis Island. And for people who might have visited Ellis Island before, you'll know that on the tour, a huge part of the museum, and you can actually take a tour of the island. It's dedicated to the hospitals because when immigrants came to the country, you were assessed on whether or not you were worthy to come into the country. A lot of that was also just driven by workforce and like work eligibility and whether or not they thought that you were strong enough or healthy enough to work. And how that justified immigration policies. So to compare our immigration today with Title 42, looked at that, and then looked at HIV, looking at how policies were being pushed with HIV being set under a communicable disease, under the health related grounds of ineligibility, and looking at how the different presidents and then also Congress were pushing forth policies that also pressure the public health service to add HIV to those health related grounds of ineligibility, and how that kind of paralleled a lot of what happened during Title 42. And understanding this history instead of being like, oh, we are the land of the free and accepting of the immigrants, questions that and looking at how this has been a repeated process and how can we then change in order to better adjust ourselves to be grounded in some of this more moral and ethical human rights related lens in a future crisis that might come.
That's very interesting that you mentioned the health equity and ethicalness lens. I was just wondering how you would suggest that we move forward with that lens when analyzing policy and looking upstream to the the effects of new policies, especially as we continue to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we should do is be more forceful and questionative of why policies are being put forth. Um, so I think one of the things is that, like, we talked a little bit about how public health could be used as a justification, as a mask. One of the things that we could do, not just as public health practitioners, but also just as a society at large, is questioning these things, not necessarily just accepting that, oh, there is Title 42, it's on the books, it's a law that can use to justify it. Instead of just accepting that at point blank, saying, why is that even a law that exists in the first place? And using that as a means of how we then assess future policies. Next thing that I would say is that when we look at immigration policies, we look at things like these health related grounds of ineligibility, again, because they exist and we just accept them, but pressing on the fact that we still deny people for having a mental or physical disability. How is that ethical? Or how is that something that we should just accept? Or why is that something that we should just accept? Why do we make it so that people have to jump through hoops in order to come into the country for something that probably shouldn't be even in the first place a reason that it can be denied? And looking at how we can then push forward and I guess question the status quo would be my main um, ideal or suggestion that would be put forth.
Oh, sorry about that. I think something just happened weird with my computer. I'm just gonna crop
You're
this
good.
part out.
You're good.
But very interesting. I'm just going to move on to the next question.
Sounds good. Yeah.
What were your overall findings in regards to communicable diseases, required vaccinations, disabilities, and substance use disorders?
Yeah. I think the focus was mostly on communicable diseases, so I'll start with that. And so looking at how policies do have a major impact on pure numbers of people who are immigrants who are denied and accepted into the country. That we can look at these policies as these high level things that presidents or Congress is putting forward, but they have a real life impact on the number of people, on the people's lives that are being impacted. So when you look at the data of how the number of people increases who are denied, the number of people decreases who are denied, and lining that up with different policies that were put forth is really interesting. And just acknowledging that fact and that finding that these are not just high level policies that are being put forth, they have a real life impact on the ground. That's part one. Part two is looking at how these policies have stayed in place for so long is just shocking to me. And why we don't necessarily change the policies over time. I talked about stagnation, and that I think was one of the major findings of looking at how things like, or when I will talk specifically now about COVID, but we had vaccines created. We understood more about the number of people or how communicable the reproductive number was. That is one category. Then we also knew that there were shortages of ventilators and things like that. That is another grouping that we looked at in terms of like transmissibility and prevention. Um, and then we also looked at things related to COVID in terms of our like immigration policies that were put forth in turn, like when Omicron started, there was a policy that was put forth to stop people or directly targeting immigrants from Southern African countries, and looking at that category of impact that COVID had. And we lump all of these together, you see the stagnation of the same policy has been put forth, even though there were vaccines created, even though we knew more about the disease or about COVID in this case, and that I think is really alarming and something that we should pry more on. Um, Vaccinations, I think, fit into that also. That first learned or finding that we had, when you see I write about a little bit in the paper. It wasn't necessarily the focus, but HPV was something that was there are vaccination requirements that were put forth at the end of the Bush administration, and then ultimately were implemented during the Obama administration, and stopped at somewhere in between the Obama administration. When you look at the chart about or the graph that I created about vaccination requirements, you see a spike up in the number of people who were denied during this time, and then a drop down immediately after these policies were taken out. And while I can't say that this is 100% why everybody was denied, the lining up of these policies is very interesting. I think could be a whole nother research policy moving forward. Um, and then the same thing happens with things like communicable, substance use disorders, and looking at how our narratives about how we treat people who use drugs impacts the way that we target people who are coming into the country and saying whether or not they are worthy of coming in.
Just to be clear, you mentioned the spike up for HPV and substance use disorders and the lower spike. Are these referring to the Bush administration and the Obama administration, respectively?
Yeah, for the at least for the vaccination requirements, I think that was where I saw the biggest jump and spike and drop, and that I thought was interesting. And that was because there was a policy that was initiated under the Bush administration, implemented by the Obama administration, and then ultimately, after a lot of pushback, that was ultimately dropped in the middle of the Obama administration.
Now, from this perspective, it seems very shocking almost to see the stagnation of these policies. And especially after seeing like the downstream effects of them. And my kind of follow-up question is, why do you think this kind of stagnation happens, and whose responsibility is it to
Mm,
protect immigrants and prevent this from happening?
yeah, I think one of it's not underappreciated, but one of the challenging aspects of policies and laws is that once it's on the book, it is really hard to get it off the books. And I think that is one of the things that I also learned after doing this research is that, and why I put forth some of the recommendations and what we talked about here as well about why we should question things at the start is because once a law is passed, it is very hard for both houses of Congress, especially now where there are even more partisanship, for them to agree on something to take it off the books or to adjust it a little. And then if it is one presidential administration that is pushing forth something, chances are they're not going to relent on that policy. And therefore, it's going to take another presidential administration to come in order to get it off the books. So I think that is one of the challenges of that drives some of this stagnation is as one. The second part is the stigma and fear that sometimes gets ingrained. So I look at HIV specifically because there was a lot of stigma about people who had HIV. There was a lot of fear from people who were in the country and like did not want to get HIV. And that fear also then further drives some of these policies because well, if there are people who put a law on the books or policy implemented policies in an administration and the public agrees with them, then adds another barrier to changing it, and therefore is why some of this stuff gets stagnant. And then the last category, the third group that I'd say is that I also don't think that one of the sad parts is that, or at the end of the day, public health I don't think has been given enough respect or enough funding, enough emphasis in our country. And until that respect is that hopefully we I think we saw some of that happen during COVID, that it was gained. Whether or not it lasts and whether or not people actually continue to fund public health is a whole nother issue. And that I also think adds to the stagnation of policies.
With that being said, how would you consider your research to be directly related to health equity and social justice?
Yeah. I think one of the things is that looking at this lens of human rights grounded immigration policy, um, and that is the first thing that I would like want the takeaway to be is that we have these policies on the book that we say are justified by public health. But if we really want to be promoting social justice and equity, if we really want to be anti-racist, that we have to confront the fact that this is what history is. One of the things that actually also started this research was there was a paper that was put out in 2020 and also various articles that people were putting out about Title 42, essentially saying that Title 42 is like a blimp in American history. It goes against American values. If you look at our research, if you look at history, that's not simply not true. That is a part of American values. This is what America has done since the founding of our nation. And the way that we look at health in justifying how we treat immigrants is not something new that just happened under Trump. If it's not only something new that happened under Trump because it also was now still continued under Biden. And we're looking at these policies not necessarily as accepted for the fact of they exist. But if we really want to promote social justice, it's looking at how this has been something that our country has done over and over again. And how do we change that moving forward instead of just repeating that process?
Kind of a follow-up question to that is, how, as individuals or members of very diverse different fields within
Mm,
public health or interested in public health, do we challenge those norms and promote this viewpoint of American history in order to move forward in an anti-racist way?
yeah. Um, I think initially, just as a one person alone and looking at yourself, assessing how you talk about immigration and how you treat immigrants and how you look at immigration policies is just part one. And that's not everybody's going to agree on the same thing, but at least internally assessing how you think about immigration and immigrants. Next, I think because it is tied a little bit to the policy work that we looked at, just holding administrations and holding congressional officials, representatives accountable and pushing. I think a lot of people talk about like, oh, calling your senators and calling your representatives, right, being and going to protest and things like that. That's all important. So hopefully that is something that people engage in. Another part is, as you talked about, like coming from diverse fields, that might not be what everybody's skill set is or what everybody finds as something that they can do. One of the things that we saw at the start of Title 42 expulsions and as they're being implemented, we saw medical doctors and directors of hospitals signing on to letters to the administration saying, this is not public health grounded justification. So using your public health research background and your expertise is a means of lending credibility to a movement that might be with lawyers who are suing the administration for things like Title 42. And that pairing of not just looking at it in silos, but using what your skills are as a means of pushing forward a collective agenda. And the last thing is just looking at some of this ideals of how we look at public health informed public health justified immigration policies is looking at how immigration response in these crises. It's just to allow for some of these changing and developments of contributing to the public health research that then could be used by a CDC official to then justify the removal of a policy, if that makes sense. Of like, it's not necessarily that everybody has to do the same thing, but using your skills as a means to push forth this collective social wealth, social equity agenda.
Thank you very much for kind of coming on to the show and sharing that piece of advice. I definitely agree with you and think that it's a personal commitment, even though we may all come from very different parts of life and of the career field, just to unite under this idea that we need to kind of enact change and stand up for what we believe to be right in this country. On that note, do you have any last comments regarding your research or anything else about the field?
Um, I think the last thing that I would say is that there is a ton of work that needs to be done in looking at immigration and public health. I think one of the things that we've been able to focus on as a public health field is very important nonetheless, like this, as a field itself of looking at immigrant health and like how immigrants navigate healthcare systems and how immigrants interact with different um, policies that allow them to qualify for different health insurances and things like that. What doesn't get enough attention is this area of who even comes into the country in the first place and why are we allowing these policies. So I think if we could also have more people doing this kind of work, whether that be lawyers or public health practitioners, and combining that would be great. Secondly, is just the last note that I'll end on is that when we look at immigration policies, we can't just look at them and accept them as point blank, like I said before, as matter of the fact. At the end of the day, these policies have a direct impact on the immigrants who are actually applying to immigrate into the country or applying for adjustment of status once they're in the country, and having a little compassion for how these policies actually have an impact on people's lives, and looking at how that then impacts the way that we treat immigrants. The last thing that I'll say is that specifically related to Title 42, the COVID-19 pandemic national emergency is ending in May, and that is ultimately what led the Supreme Court a few weeks ago to say, okay, we don't need to even hear whether this case about Title 42 because the pandemic is gonna national emergency that allows that Title 42 expulsions to happen is gonna end in May. What we aren't talking enough about is what happens once that ends. The Biden administration and other Immigration advocates are now at a point where we're looking at immigration into the country without Title 42 as what the past two administrations have been using as a backstop to preventing immigrants from coming into the country. How do we then treat immigrants once this national emergency is ended and the administrations cannot just say, okay, we can't let people in. People are going to have to go through the asylum process. There are various issues within the processing of asylum and the backlogs of it already. So just keeping in mind that just because Title 42 is not going to be justified anymore because there was a national emergency in 2 months from now, is that immigration, because of public health related justifications, still exists. And how are we going to more equitably, more socially, responsibly, more ethically treat these people who are applying and coming into the country or crossing the border?